You are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For the penultimate episode of this podcast under its current name, I had the opportunity to interview Mark Jamilkowski. Mark is the author of the historical fiction book, The Road to Moresco. I'm here with Mark Jamilkowski, who is the author of the historical fiction book, The Road to Moresco. Mark, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Aaron.
Where did you grow up and why did you move to New York City?
Yeah, I grew up in Connecticut, small town outside of Hartford. And, it's one of these things where the job market leads you in a direction and you follow that. And one thing led to another. And that's how I found myself in New York City.
You run a healthcare startup business. What is the name of your business and how does it work?
Right. Yeah. So my career has predominantly been one in the healthcare industry. I started as an actuary working at an insurance company in Hartford. Worked my way into New York City to be a consultant, and then from there built out a network of individuals who ultimately led to connections where we started this company. And it's your typical Silicon Valley backed insurance company startup kind of idea. We had a dream in five PowerPoint slides, and we got some funding in 2018. We started building it. We are headquartered in Dallas. Every Health is the name of the company, EVRY. Our effort is really to try to change the dynamics and how we think about health insurance and bring about a value proposition for health insurance that people today just are not used to having. Just to change the entire dynamic of how you interact with the healthcare system, the support that we receive as patients and consumers, and really change the entire experience.
And for some of our listeners that might not be familiar with Southern New England, Hartford, Connecticut is a major insurance industry oriented economy.
Yep.
And for a time after the American Civil War, back at like the late 19th century, for like a couple decades or more, it was I think like the wealthiest or one of the wealthiest cities in the United States.
It was it had its heyday, I would say, in the early 1900s. Yeah, this is all very true. One of the reasons why Connecticut moved the capital from New Haven up to Hartford was because of the concentration of financial wealth and financial management that was happening in Hartford, and the type of economic growth and prosperity that was being supported and driven out of the Hartford area. Yeah, it has lost a lot of its luster from that perspective. Insurance companies have moved to other states. Other states and other cities have wooed them away with various incentives and whatnot. But that's still very much Hartford's call to fame.
Feel free to tell our listeners more about yourself.
Oh, sure. Well, I appreciate that. After going down to New York, I became a father. We've lived and raised our child here in New York. Been spending my career working on a variety of entities, consulting companies in particular, especially out of New York, working with health systems and health plans, government agencies, on how to understand the challenges and opportunities and strategies, and really working with all aspects of the healthcare system from that perspective. While I'm not doing that on a regular basis, I like to sing in a local choir. Music has always been a big part of my life. When I was in school, I used to play trombone in a jazz band, and choir is a lot easier than trombone, especially for neighbors in New York City. um, yeah, and some of the things I like to do in my spare time, I'm a voracious reader. I love to play board games, games of strategy in particular. Love to cook. And when I'm not doing any of those other things, I even find time to write. And so I wrote a book.
Without spoiling too much of your historical fiction book, The Road to Moresco, what is that about?
Yeah, I happened to meet one of the characters. First, preface this by The Road to Moresco, while historical fiction in its category, is largely based on fact. Clara and her mother, Maria Luisa Moresco, are the two foundational characters in the story. When I had a chance to meet Clara, it was interesting, and I began to learn more about her life. It became even more interesting. I began to see my parents through a different lens because Clara just talked about different things and how she grew up and the kinds of things that she experienced in her life. And I realized that there was a whole host of things that I didn't really understand about my parents and what they lived through. So it just kind of reshaped my understanding and my relationship with my parents as well in that regard. Anyway, as I started digging in on Clara's life and understanding more about it, the story sort of unfolded. So the premise of the story is Maria Luisa Moresco is a young woman. She's born in the early 1900s. She's born in Italy. There's not a lot of support for a woman growing up in early 1920s, 1930s Italy to basically branch out and find a career for themselves. It's very much about staying at home, raising a family, running the household, supporting your man kind of idea. Clearly, there were a lot of political and socioeconomic challenges with that time period in Italy. World War II on the horizon. Struggling through all of that, the relationships she had, trying to raise her daughter, who was born in 1937, and really the whole period of time there between before World War II, during the war, Cold War, all of that time period is kind of the background of not only Maria Luisa's evolution and growth as a woman herself into realizing what her dreams are, but it's also very much the foundational elements of how Clara, her daughter, ultimately became a woman and how that impacted her in her later life, really starting from her time as a teenager and during the Cold War, living on an army base in Stuttgart, all the way through for the rest of her life, and until she passed away and living in Florida. So it is really the lifespan of these two women, the things they dealt with, the challenges they faced, the traumas they had to overcome, and the resilience and persistence of both of them to be who they needed to be, to become, their true selves, if you will, and to basically survive and thrive as well.
Now, how did you come to meet Clara?
Yeah.
How did you get to know about her?
Yeah. Well, as it happens, Clara and I crossed paths before I even had a chance to meet her. And I can't give away too much in the book because there's a little bit of a twist to how this all comes about. But it happened through sort of a mutual sort of a mutual circumstance that we just happened to bump into each other. There were some initial conversations that took place that were, I would say, sort of a "Hey, how are you?" kind of. Let's get to meet each other and learn a little bit more about each other, which ultimately blossomed into something that ended up being much deeper, much richer over time. So it was a very interesting evolution of a relationship that was completely unexpected, and actually came at an interesting time of my life, because I wasn't necessarily looking for the relationship, but I was open to it. Does that make sense? And
Yes.
yeah, and I sort of allowed it to take an organic path, and just and without necessarily trying to force it or prescribe it into a certain box. It was sort of just it was going to just follow its own energy, if you will. And yeah, it was quite interesting. It was a quite interesting sequence of dialogues and learning more about everything. She would tell me these stories. I'd be like, wait, you were like 7 years old when that happened. First, how do you remember that? Second, like, what was your parents doing? That's kind of, it became very intriguing, almost like an investigative reporter. She just captured my attention, and we entertained each other that way.
How long did it take you to write the book?
It's interesting. I'm not a writer, as I mentioned. I'm very much finance and all about healthcare and whatnot. And I didn't even really set about writing a book, quite frankly. It was just this little side project that I was doing. I like to take notes when I read. Um, as I was talking with Clara, she was telling me things. I got confused on her personal life's timeline. I started making an outline in order to try to track her timeline, right? Then I started trying to put the pieces together to understand where her mother uh, had gone and been during her life, because Clara's natural father passed away in 1937 before she was born. So it was one of these things that she never actually got to know him. That he was a complete, he wasn't really in the picture at all. It was just more a matter of her mother and her. But then there was so many things going on during that time period in the 1900s that I really didn't have a firm grasp of. Yeah, you study this stuff in school, but you study it for passing a test or whatever. I didn't really study it or read about it with an interest towards really understanding versus knowing. That makes sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So going back and rereading about World War I, World War II, the Cold War, what life was like in Germany, what life was like in Italy. I'm taking all these notes. I'm trying to put context to this outline that I started creating off the life of Maria Luisa and Clara. And I had something like 18 pages of notes. And I thought to myself, wow, I don't know, maybe 18 pages turns into something. If I started writing this, what would it look like? Could this be a story that other people would be interested in hearing? I passed the idea through a couple of friends, and they were like, "Oh, that sounds really cool. That's really interesting. Really, that happened?" Well, okay, so I was all right. I got a little encouragement, and I sat down, and in about 4 months, I banged out 160 pages. But I'll tell you, Aaron, I didn't know what to call it. To me, it's just a project, just something I had done for myself more than anything else, right? I really didn't have a perspective or a way of really pushing this out any further than it was. So I reached out on. Are you familiar with the platform called Nextdoor?
I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's like one of these apps that connects people in the local community, and they try to concentrate on it by zip code, right? So when you go on and you log in, you tend to only see people who are in your immediate, like, half-mile radius kind of idea. So it's neighbors connecting with neighbors in essence. And being in New York City, I got a lot of neighbors, within a half mile, especially. And I just went on there and I said, hey, listen, is anybody available? I got this project. I'm looking for a ghostwriter. If it's interesting, you can take it to the next level, do something with it. If not, let me know that too. That's okay. It just was it was an interesting project for me, and I just didn't know how far it could go. A couple people read it and they said really encouraging words and thought that it told a good story. It was captivating. It definitely needed editorial support, but they didn't feel comfortable taking it on as and rewriting it, or even being a ghostwriter to complete it. They encouraged me to do it. I didn't have any idea what next steps needed to be, and I just happened to be in Austin on business, attending a conference, and I bumped into they had an annual book fair during that weekend, which was also happenstance. And I just happened to bump into a publisher at the publisher tent at the annual Austin Book Fair, who, after a sequence of trial and error, took me under her wing, and she taught me a bunch of tricks of the trade, if you will, the editorial process. And that's how eventually we ended up at 310 pages and actually have a book. And so it wasn't necessarily something I set out to do, but it found me.
Now, is The Road to Moresco, is that self-published, traditionally published, or published by a hybrid press?
I have it published through a Kindle Direct Publishing, so I guess that classifies
it
it
as a
as
self-publishing distributor.
Book. Right, exactly.
Are you currently writing or planning to write more books? And if so, what are some ideas you have for books you might write?
Yeah, thanks. It's funny. I actually stressed about this because, again, with Maria Luisa and Clara, a lot of fact, right? It's more of their biography than anything else. Sure, it's historical fiction because there are elements in the story that I just didn't know, and there was no way to validate or confirm anything or corroborate. So you have to fill in the gaps with the fiction element of it, and because it's fill in the gaps with fiction, naturally, historical fiction, it falls out to be. And I thought about, like, okay, well, now that I've published this first one, which was a huge leap for me in terms of being vulnerable enough to do it, even to take the time and efforts to do it, then being vulnerable enough to press that little publish book button, which was terrifying. But now that it's out there, I thought, well, do I have it in me to write a second book? And what would I write that book about? And it was very stressful to think about that, because I don't have another Clara. I don't have another outline, another bibliography, if you will, of someone's life to base the next story on. This next one is going to have to come from me completely. Through one sequence or another, I have actually landed on something that I think is going to be really interesting. I don't know what the final form is going to look like in terms of, it's another historical fiction-based book idea. It's ancient Rome, specifically the time of Augustus. But there's so much written about that time period, and in Augustus specifically, that there is almost an overwhelming amount of material to draw from. So I thought I was going to go down the direction of one particular avenue, which dealt with a found artifact, sort of like you think of like a archaeologist uncovers something, has an artifact, there's a mystery to it, uncovering the provenance of this artifact, and that was found at a place that was not expected. Feel like an ancient Roman artifact found in, let's say, like India, for example, right? And then kind of uncovering the provenance of this artifact and leading us to discovery of some hidden secret and some big reveal and mystery. That was kind of the initial idea. But yeah, it's again a lot of reading, a lot of note taking, a lot of ideas, a lot of different directions it could go. And but I'm working on it. I don't know. We'll see. Listen, it took me 3 years to start to finish, between notes, reading, finding a publisher, thinking about it, working with a publisher for a year, and finally publishing the book August of 23. So if that all took 3 years to do all that, I'm really just starting this pathway for the second one. But it could be exciting. I don't know. It's more again, it's more about like, wow, I'm open to the path. I'm not sure exactly where it's going to lead me. I got a lot of seems like every time I read a new book, or dig a little deeper into some of the facts, I come up with a slightly different angle that would be more interesting than what I thought previously.
Other than yourself, who are some of your favorite authors?
Oh, wow. Just to even consider myself an author, that's that's still a leap of faith that I'm not completely comfortable with, I have to say. You know, I have had some folks have mentioned Saul Bellow is somebody who I have had the opportunity to become aware of, and as more recently, I mean, if you had asked me, like, say 5-10 years ago, I would have given you a standard list of well-known authors that the Ernest Hemingways and F. Scott Fitzgeralds of the world, right? Joseph Conrad in Heart of Darkness is one of these books that I remember reading that and having a dramatic impact in the way that I always thought of how books should be written. So the environmental elements that you get with the Jack London kind of idea. But more recently, in slightly more sophisticated, refined sense of what it means to actually write something and to convey emotion, time, place, context, mood. I would say my more recent quote unquote discovery has been Saul Bellow, who there's just a contextual element to the way that the writing comes across that it is really very interesting. The way it conveys a sense of emotion and place. It's very captivating.
My final question for this interview. Now, the writing community on social media is not the one to be thought of as full of chronic complainers, but a common complaint that I've heard from some people in the writing community on social media is that historical fiction is oversaturated with a lot of World War II era content to the detriment of historical fiction representing other areas of history. And what would you say to people who criticize what they see as overrepresentation of the World War II era in historical fiction?
Yeah. It's interesting. I didn't really understand, or I didn't really pay attention to that particular genre until I actually got close to finishing The Road to Moresco, which I feel is much more of a character piece. It's not about the war. The war just happens in one particular chapter, and it has an influence on their lives, so it has to be discussed, right? But there's so many more interesting things that are going on around it, so it's not a main component of it. It just happens to be mentioned in it. But you're right. I think the criticisms are out there. There's just so many different, now I think, better understood nuances to what happened during World War II, and there are so many new perspectives that are open to interpretation, with regards to everything going on during that time period. That you have a confluence, I think, of two separate energies. The first being, it's easier than ever to be self-published. Kindle Direct Publishing and platforms like it, you basically can load the telephone book up into these platforms and press publish, and it will pass and be published. So there's really the days of having to be screened by an editorial board at a more established publishing house, of which there are 6, and you needed to have somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody and an agent to connect all the dots for you, is kind of being undermined a bit by the opportunity to be able to self-publish with Adobe and a Kindle Direct Publishing account. That being said, and I'm not faulting these platforms, I think they also do a service, sort of democratizing the opportunity for people to try their hand at being an author. I think that there's just a lot of people who are also heavily impacted by, or what their basis of knowledge is, heavily resides in that time period. So their knowledge, the ready access to a lot of information regarding that time period, the amount of complexity and challenges associated with that time period, combined with the ease of publication, kind of bring this opportunity to flood the market with one particular topic. I'm willing to bet that if you turn back the hands of time to the mid 1800s, people were probably complaining, "Oh no, not another story about the French Revolution." I'm sure they were having some of the similar complaints during those time periods as well. I think that new perspectives are always interesting. I just hope that what I do brings an element of freshness to the conversation. And it's not just a regurgitation of facts and figures, but really brings the human element in a way that's unexpected. For me, basing my story on 2 specific characters as they lived through that time period, I tried to really draw out historical facts that were true and relevant and factual to that time period, but more so in terms of what it meant in terms of the context of these people's lives, and how did it impact them as they were trying to survive it. What did it mean to be a prisoner of war with the Russians holding war tribunals in Prague after the collapse of Nazis? What did it mean for them to live on a military base in Stuttgart during the time when Germany was split into 2? Cold War was very much on everybody's mind. It's not about specifically what was happening from a political perspective, but what was the impact on the real life people who were being, in essence, influenced or traumatized by the various elements of life during that time period. I think that's what I try to do. And if I proceed forward with this whole time period of ancient Rome, which I'm willing to bet is probably number 2 on the, oh my God, not another one about ancient Rome and Roman Empire. Oh no. But it will be the same idea. Try to do something different, bring about a different perspective, try to put a fresh lens to something that, from a topic perspective, maybe people feel is saturated, but it's not about troop movement and military conquest, but more about the lives of people who were actually affected by that time period.
Mark, you were an amazing guest for this podcast, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast.
I thank you again for giving me this opportunity to talk about the road to Moresco, Aaron, and to spend this time with you. I really appreciate it and enjoyed it.
The 6th season finale, which will be the final episode of the Heartland Author podcast before the name of the podcast changes to Apollo Papyrus, will be uploaded later today, December 23rd. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACScribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.